Good morning, everyone. Buju Gakanawia. I want to say miigwech for being here together with us again today. I'll just introduce myself again. Kishababana Sikh, Nindigenakaz, Gabskigama Ndunji, Benesi Wagandundem. My English name is Brenda. I'm from Swan Lake First Nation, and I belong to the Thunderbird clan. So I'm very honored and super thankful to be introducing Sandra DeLaronde this morning. DeLaronde is a member of Cross Lake First Nation, whose roots are in the Métis settlement of Duck Bay. Throughout her distinguished career, she made it her life work to bring attention to the situation of MMIWG2S. She served as a co-chair for Manitoba's MMIWG2S coalition. DeLaronde helped develop and oversee the Helen Betty Osborne Memorial Scholarship, established in 2000 to honor the young women who was murdered in the PAW in 1976. DeLaronde is generous in sharing her knowledge and culture with others. As head woman of the Sundance and the heart of the White Buffalo Moon Dance, she plays a vital role in strengthening Indigenous community, practice, and tradition. Sandra will be presenting her keynote address, Moving Forward in a Good Way. What does the finding of genocide mean? The implications to Canada from a social justice perspective. So please join me in welcoming Sandra. Thank
you. Good morning, all, and thank you so much for that introduction. Oh, dear. I forgot my note on my phone, but that's okay. Yeah. So I have some friends that couldn't make it today, so they asked me to record it. So thank you to Elizabeth for holding the phone, because it would look pretty funny if I held it up here. Shayla Elizabeth. So I'd like to pay respect to this holy land that we stand on. This land is holy because of the ancestors that walked on it, the ancestors that you bring with you to this land, and the lives that we all live here together. So I just want to recognize the sacredness of your ancestors and mine, and how they are together, all together in this room as we gather to do something different, to live out our calling in this reality, to create change. So I want to acknowledge the families and the survivors that gave their stories that held the stories of their loved ones, that informed the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and whose stories have created the 231 calls to justice. This has been a long time coming. For myself personally, within my lifetime, I've lived through the murder of Helen Betty Osborne and grew up in that culture of silence and culture of fear, and I know that one of my friends had told me, you know what people are saying about the women from the PAW? And I said, no, that they all have PTSD because of the death of Helen Betty Osborne. And it's true, I guess, to the extent that how we lived our lives, how we created safety plans as young girls and women, really informed our lives going forward. I don't know how this works. So talk about the National Inquiry, and you heard yesterday. This presentation is going to flow like water, so if it takes side turns, it's going to get to where it needs to go in the end. So let's flow together, I guess. So we know that genocide itself isn't stagnant, as Dr. de Hamel referred to yesterday, and it's not just one event, and it's something that, in this country has had a very long journey, from colonization to the Indian Act, residential schools, and I'm not going to talk about any of that because it has been said, and there's lots of scholarly articles and certainly press on each of those. To yesterday, when I will note, though, yesterday, the charging of Father Massey, who had spent many years in the Indigenous communities, not just in Seguin, but also in Pine Creek, Duck Bay, and I noticed going through my Facebook yesterday where one woman had mentioned that she was just devastated because she had been baptized by Father Massey, and so each person whose lives he touched have been impacted by the news of the charges yesterday. And that's only one out of thousands. So we move on. So just to acknowledge that there's still more work to do. There's always more work to do. So the inquiry had a very specific mandate to look into the violence against Indigenous women and girls, including sexual violence. And this, I have to say, in Manitoba, as a coalition, that we went toe-to-toe with the National Inquiry, and we're, one of these people, one of those organizations that really worked hard to ensure that the inquiry was trauma-informed and, a process that was inclusive. And I have to say that the inquiry listened. There were, a legal framework that they had to follow, but they went outside that framework and created something different so that they could respond to the families and survivors in a good way. And I think that absolutely made a difference. What the inquiry also did that was different and outside of their mandate was to include the voices of gender diverse peoples. That was outside their mandate, but they found in the early part of their discovery that violence against two-spirited, gender diverse people was not something that had ever been considered. And so, there are specific calls to justice, distinction-based calls to justice for 2S LGBTQIA persons included in the report. And I think it also acknowledges the agency of two-spirited individuals. So I think it was a very tough inquiry set in a legal framework and context that Canada could understand, at the same time honoring and respecting the specific needs of those that had worked for at least 2 generations to have an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The final report had found many inequities in the end, that in specific areas, and you can see the specific areas. And it's hard to say, you know, what has precedence over the other in implementation, because they all need to be able to move together to create change. What I was thinking this morning was reflecting on the words that are attributed to Louis Riel, that he said that in 100 years from now, my people will rise again, and it'll be through the artists, something to that effect. And I think of that and how the early creative energy that recognized in Indigenous people or Indigenous women really recognized us from a deficit position, though art may be beautiful. And the example that comes to mind is the Ecstasy of Rita Jo. You know, that definitely a work of art, but really emphasizes the tragic circumstances that many Indigenous women, over 2,000 known deaths, murders, have been subject to. And then we look at the most recent type of art that has been brought forward by Indigenous creatives. And again, you know, looking at Going Home Star, that was produced by Tina Keeper. Another ballet that really speaks to the strength and resilience of Indigenous women and girls. And if you were at the ballet, it was such a moving experience that when they brought the cast out for their to take their bows, when the dancer came out who played the priest, he, you know, like everyone just kind of went silent, you know, because he had played the part so well. I felt bad for him. But so, you know, so there's a shift when the stories are told by Indigenous creatives. The other one I also think of, like in the body of work produced by Tina Keeper, is Through Black Spruce. In the end, you know, the Indigenous female lead didn't die, but she stood her ground, right? So those little shifts, really big shifts, having the stories told is a way that I think that media and social influencers can create change. When the media first started reporting on Helen Betty Osborne, they showed photos of her lying in the snow with just a pair of rubber boots on. and, the snow being bloodstained. It took almost 25 years to shift the media so that they began to show pictures of her high school picture, and to show her as a person with vitality and dreams. But that was because of, pushing, keeping the heat on where possible to create that change, that shift as to how Indigenous women and girls are viewed. Same thing with Tina Fontaine. The first pictures they showed of her was not, and they called her a young woman. Well, she was actually a girl, so that the pictures that they show of her now are pictures of her as a girl. But it's something that you have to really keep on top of, that change does take place. So if we just want to go up to, thanks Evan for using his Facebook to bring this short video on.
We pray for our Indigenous women and young girls who have been murdered and for those who are still missing.
Regarding the outcomes of the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people. So the key finding of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry was that Helen Betty Osborne would have not been murdered had she not been an Indigenous woman. So that finding was in 1991. The commission into the National Inquiry into Indigenous women and girls and survivors and two-spirited people took up the challenge and said, yes, there is a problem, and the problem is genocide. That is the boldest statement that any inquiry has made or could make, and it is the truth that has been shared by families, survivors, experts in the course of the inquiry. And we know as Indigenous women that injustice has a name, and that name is genocide.
My sister-in-law, 23 years ago, was murdered around this time of the year. She was buried around the 22nd of June. And just this January, Tracy's daughter was killed in January, murdered, and we buried her a few months ago. So those things happen before they're still happening. We've got to find ways of dealing with it.
So during that journey, I didn't realize that within our region, once I was elected in 2015, I was reminded that a milestone was accomplished by an Aboriginal woman. That this town where Helen Betty Osborne was murdered, this community, this region where Helen Betty Osborne was murdered, elected They're the first Aboriginal woman to Manitoba Legislative Assembly. And to me, that was had a profound effect on me. And as an Aboriginal woman, that shame is no longer there. If you ever come across a young girl who has low self-esteem because of racism, discrimination, because she's a woman and more importantly, an Aboriginal woman, please hug her, hold her, and tell her she's very important and she's loved.
There was a 2-year inquiry. Over 1,500 people were interviewed. There was 4 commissioners that took part and did the work, traveled all across Canada, listened to many, many stories from people who were affected by this conversion against women and girls. There was a word that makes people very uncomfortable, and the word genocide was used.
This inquiry was different because we weren't talking about a historical issue or a broad-based or theoretical issue. We were talking about the lives of women and girls and Two-Spirit people that go missing every day and continue to go missing every day. So how can we change that? How can we be change makers as individuals to create a safer space? I think the calls for justice give us that roadmap, and it's up to each and every one of us to create safer spaces, because it starts with one person to make that difference, and that one person is me, and that one person is you. So I really believe that one person is me and one person is you, and we often, so when people think of genocide, as Dr. Duhamel had mentioned yesterday, that they think of the Holocaust as an event or a period of time. For Indigenous women, this period of time spans generations. And to understand it, all those events that make up this genocide and continue to make up this genocide, I think it's important to reflect on our own personal stories and to let you know how long it's been. So when the treaties were being negotiated in Canada, I'm going to tell you how this genocide impacts me personally. Treaty 4, the negotiations for Treaty 4. So I want to talk about the systemic and ongoing negation of the role of matriarchy in our societies, and how it still has an impact today. In the negotiation of Treaty 4, and I'm not going to use dates because I don't remember dates very well, but I can say our grandmother was the matriarch or the head woman of Duck Bay. And she went to the negotiations for Treaty 4. And the government negotiators refused to have her speak, to allow her to speak. So as a result of that, on that first negotiation, Duck Bay was left out of Treaty 4. So they were meeting again the next year, Canada with the bands to do the adhesion to Treaty 4. Not to be misplaced again. And often, when we talk about leadership and about women, we think of water, right? So this grandmother that I'm directly descended from decided she would name her son-in-law as head man for the purposes of signing the treaty. And so in the Treaty 4 adhesion, because of that move, then Treaty 4 became part of then the Duck Bay half-breed band. And specifically, I'm saying that specifically, became recognized under Treaty 4. Also, to note that it is the only time in treaty negotiations that a half-breed community was recognized in the treaty-making process, other than the negotiation of the Manitoba Act, which people consider to be a Métis treaty, though not a numbered treaty. So then we move forward through the generations. At some point, Duck Bay was taken out of Treaty 4. I don't know why. That is still under renegotiation or reexamination by the state and the descendants of the Duck Bay half-breed band. So women then that's on my paternal side. Then on my mother's side, my grandmother had lost her status when she married my grandfather, who was also like a Scottish half-breed from the Red River. And like many others, had been forced off of the community, or sent to the other side of the river and not allowed to go back home. Even when they were having ceremonies. And I remember specifically my mother telling me about her mother's people having a making a man ceremony. And so their family, along with the others, had gone by canoe across the river and were not allowed to get out of their canoe because they were no longer members of that band and were sent home. And that really, again, created further divisions within families that, were probably not necessary. I know families fight anyway, but they don't have to be supported by governments to continue to harm the ongoing safety of that exists within families. So then around the 1960s, so there's my mother's family and my dad's family, and in order to survive, they had to hide their heritage, which is pretty, difficult when you're pretty brown, But I know on my dad's birth certificate it says French half-breed, right? My mom's, it's Scottish half-breed. It's not about being Ojibwe Cree, it was, recognized from a non-Indigenous perspective. So then it comes to me. So I'm here and recognized as a member of Cross Lake First or Pimicikamak Cree Nation or Cross Lake Band of Indians, depending on, whose framework you're paying attention to, because women had to fight to regain status and fight hard. They couldn't fight within Canada because Canada didn't pay attention. So they had to go to an international tribunal to get a ruling which required Canada to reinstate women and their families to their families of origin. And that in Canada became known as Bill C-31. And under Bill C-31, there's a process of which a numbered process, 6-1, 6-2, and then if you were 6-1 and married someone or who had children. No, I'll just say, so legally, if you were married legally to someone who was non-Indigenous, then your children were 6-2. If your children married someone who was non-Indigenous, they didn't carry that legal status back. If your children, so when my grandmother was reinstated, she was reinstated as a 6-1, I believe. So my mother became a 6-2. So she couldn't, we couldn't gain status under that, under her, even though we would be, considered a matriarchal society, and that this was a matriarchal rule. So my dad's family, because of the grandmother who had negotiated the treaty, the adhesion to Treaty 4, or told her son-in-law how to negotiate the treaty, we were able to then put a 6-1 and a 6-2 together, and then we became 6-1, so we got status. But it was like, how do you do that? So there, so not only was that a fight, from 7 generations ago to now, that's really an example of how genocide works. And we know that in this country that we are never going to get anything by asking for it, that we have to fight for it when it comes to our rights and recognition of the agency of Indigenous women. So, again, there's the definition of genocide. The National Inquiry has an awesome report that you should really take the time to read. Good summer reading. So the QR code takes you to the report, if you want to take that. Out of the 231 calls to justice, they call upon federal, provincial, and territorial governments, but also they call upon Indigenous governments, in quotations, because really, unless you are a community or a First Nation, others that come and speak on behalf of the people, such as the Assembly of First Nations or the Métis National Council or the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, are really nonprofit organizations that, have the ability to be an order of government, but are not in that place where they can take on those responsibilities. Just going to go back. So specifically, the National Inquiry had called upon all governments to make changes to frame it within the principles of human Indigenous rights. And in Manitoba, I think it was about 3 years ago, we had a young woman come forward that spoke about how she had been violated by the Grand Chief. And we called on governments as a coalition of Indigenous women's organizations to recognize that we are in a state of emergency in this country and in this province, and that we needed a place for Indigenous women's voices to be heard. And that was, in the calling for a national ombudsperson. Brings us to today, where again, we're faced with the same kinds of I don't know what the word is that would prevent me from being charged. Where we have, people that have come forward with the same kind of concerns against the same Grand Chief. And I can tell you that my inbox and my phone has been inundated with messages from women who have not gone public with their concerns about this same person. So had the governments implemented this call 2 years ago, we would have some place for women to go, for their voices to be heard. And even now, it's, if it didn't happen 2 years ago, it can happen now, right? Governments can create a place for Indigenous women's voices to be heard. Organizations such as AMC, when they have you can function as a nonprofit organization and say that you have to work within the legal framework of a nonprofit corporation, but that doesn't get you any closer to be self-determining, right? So what we have said and what we have asked for is a parallel process that honors the voices of the women that would probably be considered to be a more matriarchal and inclusive process. And that requires organizations to make a leap, to make a leap of faith, to those things that they talk about in terms of being self-determining, wabang our tomorrows, to do things differently. And we have examples where we can do things differently. Treaty 2 has developed, with Chantal Barker, have developed a restorative practice that, if implemented, would, support the health and well-being of the community, the health and well-being of victims, and the perpetrators of violence. There was a program in Manitoba, the Hollow Water program, that was in place for almost 40 years, that dealt with sexual violence from a community-based perspective. And that program, as good as it was, really challenged the community and individuals in the community. It challenged the truth and the agency of individuals, but it did create change in the community. And so it worked for them, but it hasn't transferred to other communities or other jurisdictions. For whatever reason, it is really hard work. But those things worked, and what's different is that it was community-driven, community-led, and community-maintained. So I say, the finding of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in 1991 stated that Helen Betty Osborne would not have been murdered had she not been Aboriginal. And I think the failure to act, of governments to act on that finding and create safe spaces, gave a license to those that continued to murder Indigenous women, gave them a sense of safety that they would probably not be charged, or it would take, they could go on living their lives because police and governments really didn't care about the lives of Indigenous women and girls and gender diverse people. And we see that today. And one of the things that the another controversial finding and call of the National Inquiry was maximum sentencing for individuals that murder an Indigenous woman or girl or gender diverse person. That was met with kind of outrage by the legal community. However, that hasn't stopped, and we know in Winnipeg, 5 women are gone because of this continued failure to act. So maybe in considering the charges, I'm thinking that in addition to maximum sentencing, that they should also include the murder of Indigenous women as a hate crime, because there's nothing, we know that is a fact that that there is hate. One of the persons that was actually brought to court in the past few weeks was known through his social media for his outright hate and misogyny towards Indigenous women and girls. And while he may be charged with one death right now, they are looking into other deaths. So if we're going to change the justice system, the justice system needs to look at it's not just a murder, but it is also a hate crime, and look at the incidence of misogyny in the person's background as well. They spend more time looking at the lives of the deceased rather than looking at the lives of the accused, and I think that needs to be turned around. Also, in addition to, we see the rates of homicide, that in terms of sexual violence, there was a report done by Jane Ursel that found that I'll just say out of 1,000 reported cases of sexual violence, 16 will go forward to the Crown. Of that 16, one will go forward to the courts. Two will go forward to the courts, one will eventually be charged. So, of the ones that go forward from the Crown to the courts, those are non-Aboriginal cases, while at the front end, the majority of complainants are Indigenous women. So there's another way that that the justice system can create change, is at the front end of the system. So I'm going to as well here reference the current situation that we're in Manitoba, and that we call upon all governments to develop laws, policies, and public education campaigns to challenge the acceptance and normalization of violence. I think that if you are in an institution or a nonprofit organization that, or a government that really, it's important for you to look at those policies and practices which continue to allow for the marginalization of Indigenous women and girls. If you're an Indigenous government and you talk about self-determination, you must be the example and create changes within your structures and systems that would not defend violence, but find ways to address the harms and create sustainable change. Because these changes, if we're going to create change, has to be entrenched in our systems, so that we can't go back to where we are today. Oftentimes, if we look at change today, it really is dependent on whoever is delivering the program, depending on their hard work. It's not dependent on, the Winnipeg Police Service, because their system hasn't changed. The people in it are the ones that create the change. They have a wonderful victim advocate today that is doing some of the best work that the police service has ever had. But that work is really dependent upon that individual, not because the system has changed. So we need to find ways to entrench and stabilize change in the systems. Oh, that's done. So, just let me check my time. So one of the things that we often talk about is how do we create change? What is the impact of genocide? How can we move through genocide into a new way of being? It's, in a practical way, we have the 231 calls to justice, we have the pathway forward, and if you notice Leah Gazan's presentation yesterday, she said not $1 has been spent on addressing those calls. And I can tell you, working on the ground, that we continue to do this work with no resources. Every time we submit a proposal, that the rules change, right? So we continue to do this work because it's important. So I think one of the ways that we can begin is for that system to stop changing the goalposts, to stop moving the goalposts, and to work with people on the ground and to stop resourcing organizations that gaslight Indigenous women rather than provide safety for Indigenous women. There needs to be an independent body that women can report, and that it can be safely investigated, that organizations will change their structures. It also, I think where possible, if you're an institution, to be able to address the policies within your institution to create change. One of the things that I do is deliver a program or a course here out of the Masters in Development Practice is the 231 Calls to Justice. What's different about this course is that it has a grandmother embedded in the course, and she attends, well, it's online, so she attends every class. And because of the difficulties of the issue that we're dealing with, provides support to the students or participants on an ongoing basis throughout the program, and does the check-ins. And when we talk about a trauma-informed practice, that's part of the practice. It could be having grandmothers or aunties, and I know that unions can be involved in this too, because a lot of times we can't move forward because of union structures. So it means not having an Indigenous process fit into an institutional process. It's changing the system to include an Indigenous practice. Say, for example, in the Manitoba government, in the correction system, they have some elders, but they didn't know how to include elders. So rather than calling them that, they called them padres, I guess. So that would be, so it fit within their union agreement, rather than acknowledging and honoring the work that they do is, greater than the closest thing they could find, which was, an institutional project. So those things need to change, looking at ways that that criminal reporting goes forward, case management, through from the beginning to the court process. Also, I think just in a simple way, when Indigenous women and girls go forward, and gender diverse people go forward with a way to address the national action plan, that way is honored, and not what government thinks will be a priority. Because we're still in that space where government will say, we can't do this, but we'll do this. And it's not actually what we see as people on the ground that can be done. So governments have got to move past this process of being seen to do something, but not actually doing anything. And what does that require? That requires the reporting, the annual reporting. But it also requires people to be safe when they challenge governments and institutions. That, for example, when we had this open letter on social media and people signed it, there were individuals who were called to task by the supervisors for signing the letter and threatened with dismissal. It shouldn't have to be that way. When your work is to create safe spaces and to honor the voices of victims and then not be allowed to support them publicly. People say, oh, well, this open letter is political. As Indigenous women, when are our lives not political? They always are. So we can't use that as an excuse. I know when the coalition had presented our final report to the National Inquiry, one of the things that we knew for sure is that change would not happen through the benevolence of government, that we would have to fight every step of the way. We would have to sue governments to create change, because that's the only way change has occurred in this country for Indigenous women. And so That in itself, because we have to do that, is a form of ongoing genocide. If government wants to sit down with Indigenous women and work through the processes and resources, then that's a way to move forward in a good way. I want to acknowledge the other speakers that have been here over the last day and for today, for your courage and commitment to creating change. I want to honor my grandmother who found a way around government policy 7 generations ago. And so I am the 8th generation, and you are the 8th generation. Also the 1st generation, because we keep moving. And so we want to recognize the fire that existed in my grandmother's time and the fire that exists within your time, and how we are guided by that fire that exists within each of us. So I've lit the candle before I started and just gave you little candles to take home with you. You can light them or not, but just to recognize that fire that you have to create change. And I want to acknowledge Sheila North's call for a moment of silence for the 5 women who lost their lives to violence in the past month in Winnipeg, and how we are all really impacted by that loss. Not just as Indigenous women in our families, but our community that we love and live in. And I want to call upon each of you to use your voice to create the change. I know in our ceremonies as women, we often call out, and the story that I want to share with you is that when the herd of buffalo see danger, they bring the little ones and the old ones into the center and face outward, and keep the little ones and the old ones inside the circle till danger passes. We are in this place where each of us has to be that outer circle for our children, for our women, for our girls, for our gender diverse people, because the danger has not passed. And we need to continue to be grounded in the spirit, in our relationship with the land and with the water, in order to gain the strength that we need to continue to hold that outer circle. And we need to be able to feel free to call on creation, to intervene and to sit with us and be with us and to be us, to hold that outer circle. So I'm just going to invite you to stand, all of you to stand. If you can. If you can't, that's okay too. And I'm going to invite you to use your voice, because when we want to call and acknowledge the Spirit, we do what's called is a buffalo call. right? So we go, whoop. So I'd like to invite you all to do that with me. So 1, 2, 3, whoop. All right, stomp your feet. One more time, be the change, and 1, 2, 3, whoop. All right, thank you. So use your voices and be the change.
Lana Elliott, Bill 221 section needs changes for all cases to move forward with justice. And then criminal codes 221, and then she also says victims advocacy needs change as well. It's not set up for the victims. Example, victims impact statement can have re-victimizing effects.
I'd just like to address that in terms of victim impact statements, that, that there has to be greater use of victim impact statements and community impact statements. I know that we have, in certain cases where Indigenous women have been the victims, we have written community impact statements that were not accepted by the courts because they never called for community impact statements. But yet, as Indigenous women, we're all affected, right? So that can be an easy enough change.